I'm Philip Sabin, and this video illustrates the gameplay of my Dogfight Deluxe Total Conversion, using the counters and data cards from Lee Brimmock & Wood's excellent Wing Leader series of air combat board games from GMT. Dogfight is a separate, freestanding game, focused more on the fighting around the bombers, with shorter turns, each representing just 15 seconds of action. Although I retain Lee's side-scrolling perspective, I also reintroduce the third lateral dimension perpendicular to the board's surface, allowing flights of fighters to maneuver in 3 dimensions and chase one another's tails explicitly rather than just abstractly. Dogfight Deluxe is only one of the total conversions I've designed and progressively refined over the past few years, based on principles explained in my book, Simulating War. There is also my even more tactical top-down Wing Leader spin-off, Fighter Duel Deluxe, and my side-scrolling Canvas Aces Deluxe, which uses the beautiful counters from Carlo Amadeo's Winged Victory game of World War I air combat. All my designs may be downloaded freely from the I/O group from my book or from the Board Game Geek pages for their parent games. As long as you own the parent games, the main extra component you will need to play my Dogfight and Canvas Aces conversions is this simple gridded sky board. You may easily make this by printing onto blue card copies of the grid template which I provide in the rules, or even draw it yourself as I did, if you prefer. The unique feature of my sky grid is that the vertical dimension models not just height above the ground, as in the parent games, but also the lateral dimension, perpendicular to the board's surface. Hence, my board portrays a 3D corridor of airspace, as shown here, which may be just above the ground, or at any higher altitude up to 25,000 feet, depending on the height of the bombers on which the dogfight is focused. The board is in 4 sections, which are cycled forward to create an endless corridor to accommodate the bomber's forward flight. Each of the 96 boxes on the board contains 5 layered blocks, as shown on the left. These layered blocks abstractly represent the lateral dimension at that altitude. The flights shown are actually side by side rather than one above the other, as portrayed more literally on the right by the deluxe plastic towers which I've made for my own game set. The 2 Spitfire flights shown are at the same height, but nearly 2 miles abreast. This system reintroduces the crucial third dimension sacrificed by the novel side-scrolling abstraction in the parent games. The other key feature of my conversions is the simple tracking of aircraft speed, without the usual off-board record keeping. As shown on the top table, bombers augment their tracking die each turn by an amount depending on their speed rating and height, and each time it passes 6, they move forward an extra column. Fighter flights have 2 tracking dice, which record 6 different kinetic energies, KE, each separated by 6 energy steps, which are tracked on the smaller die. As shown on the lower tables, fighters with higher KE will move more columns and may climb and dive further. Flights may also weave 1 or 2 blocks laterally within each box, and weaving after moving just 1 column allows them to turn through 180 degrees and so swap between the 2 headings portrayed in the game. Hence, fighters whose KE is 4 or more can fly 3 columns straight ahead, or gain 2 levels in a zoom climb, but they have to make wider turns due to G-forces at their high speed. I am gradually carrying out the research to underpin a complete random scenario generation system for Dogfight Deluxe, like that included already in my Canvas Aces World War I conversion. The forthcoming system builds on Lee's 2 Wing Leader games and 4 add-on packs to create an endless variety of representative scenarios for Dogfight, covering the entire decade of global conflict from 1936 to 1945. In the meantime, players may easily set up their own scenarios using whichever games and add-on packs they own. To allow me to explain the game mechanics in detail without this video becoming too long, I've created an unusually small bespoke scenario from the early part of the Battle of Britain in summer 1940. The rules booklet recounts a more typical sample game set over Burma in late 1941 with almost twice as many counters. In both games, I report player decisions and die rolls exactly as they occurred, without artificial fixes for demonstrative effect. The board for the current scenario shows a corridor of airspace stretching from 6,000 to 18,000 feet, levels 4 to 11 in wing leader terms. In the middle of the board at level 7, just above the thicker air below 10,000 feet, which would slow them down even further, is a squadron of 12 Stuka dive bombers, easy meat for the RAF, were it not for the escorts tasked to protect them. I provide rules for random determination of sky conditions, depending on the typical weather for that location and time of year. On a d6 roll of 3, the sun is shining down from the front left of the Stukas, making it less tactically useful for either side than if it were behind them. British summers are typically partly cloudy, and on a further d6 roll of 6, there's a cloud layer at level 5, shown by the cloud overlays which I provide. I add a few wispy cloud markers at level 10, purely for orientation. To show how Dogfight differentiates aircraft performance, I've chosen to include just one flight of each of the 4 main fighter types from the battle. Lee's aircraft data cards show their respective strengths and weaknesses. The Hurricanes are slower than the others, while the Spitfires are more agile and the Bf-110s are the least manoeuvrable. To reflect the 110's disappointing performance in the battle, I use not the very latest C4 version shown, but the earlier C1 variant described on the back of the data card, with the same firepower and protection ratings as the other fighters. In Dogfight, the 110's rear guns do not fire directly, and they serve only to offset the plane's historical vulnerability. Each fighter flight in this scenario represents a schwarm of 4 German aircraft, or 6 British planes in their tactically inferior Vic formations, so the entire battle involves over 30 aircraft. The basic auto-generated escort handicap with 2 fighter flights per side is 2, so in this solo sample game, the British must score at least 3 net hits to win. In competitive games, players can adjust the basic handicap by bidding to command a preferred side, thereby taking account of specific asymmetries, such as the weak protection rating of the Stukas compared to other Luftwaffe bombers of the time. Dogfight Deluxe has a radically streamlined and improved energy change system, based on the speed rating, KE and height of the contending fighters. At the medium altitudes represented in this scenario, the fighters have a climb rating, C, of 2. So, at a KE of 2, all except the Hurricanes will gain 4 - C, or 2 energy steps per turn. Since each altitude level equates to 6 steps, this allows sustained climb rates of 1 level every 3 turns, or around 2,000 feet per minute. However, the key feature of the flight model in Dogfight is that aircraft can climb or dive much faster than this by exchanging speed for height or vice versa. Planes which change heading or weave sharply will lose the number of energy steps shown in the second table, depending on the difference between Lee's turn and speed ratings for that fighter type. A major innovation in the deluxe editions of Dogfight and Canvas Aces is that flights can pay an extra energy step to attempt a tight turn to escape or engage less maneuverable opponents. Tight turns allow fighters to reverse heading rapidly in the first part of their move, and so have time left to fly back into an adjacent block of their original column. The Germans choose to deploy their escorts the maximum 2 levels above the bombers, and also some way behind, so as to reduce the risk of overtaking the slow Stukas, which will fly 2 columns only every 6th turn. The 109s begin behind and to the right of the 110s, allowing them to cover their colleagues by weaving into the same block to counterattack any enemies that may attack them. Such covering tactics are key to success in dogfight, mirroring their importance in the real air combats concerned. Neither flight begins close enough to cover the Stukas, but there's time to remedy this once they see the direction of any British attack. There is a 2 in 3 chance that interceptors will appear in front of the bombers rather than behind, and so it proves on this occasion. The 2 British flights deploy side by side at the maximum altitude allowed by the scenario, 1 level above the Stukas but 1 level below the escorts. Each side deploys 1 flight up sun rather than down sun, just in case. In a full-size scenario, with each fighter type represented by 2 flights rather than 1, players could have opted to raise the Bf-109s or Spitfires 1 level by dropping the 110s or Hurricanes 1 level, but such initial vertical separation is not allowed with only 2 fighter flights per side. In each turn, aircraft are activated in a strict sequence of interceptors, then bombers, then escorts. Each flight attacks at the end of its own move, allowing tailing and covering to occur naturally, with no need for the special sequencing rules in other air games. To distinguish the lateral and vertical components of manoeuvres more clearly, I now show them through separate vectors, with horizontal movement shown first in red or black, followed by any climbs or dives in white. The Spitfires choose to climb, and the associated deceleration and angled movement mean they must choose a manoeuvre for a KE of 1 rather than their actual initial KE of 2. They may hence fly just 1 column back without needing to weave. They lose 6 energy steps for the climb, but gain back the usual 2 steps at their KE of 2, so their energy falls from 2.5 to 2.1. The Hurricanes now make the only 2-column move possible at a KE of 2, straight ahead without weaving. Due to their lower speed rating of 4, they begin with energy 2.4 instead of 2.5 for all the other fighters, and they gain only 1 energy step instead of 2 at this KE. However, they opt to dive to level 7, to position themselves directly ahead of the Stukas, ready for a non-oblique head-on pass, so their energy increases by a further 6 steps to 3.5. Bombers in dogfight move automatically, so the Stukas now advance the usual 1 column straight ahead, with their tracking die increasing only from 3 to 4 due to their dismal speed rating of 3. As the British had planned, this leaves the Stukas exposed to a head-on attack next turn by the Hurricanes in the matching middle block 2 columns ahead. The Bf-109s have a lower code letter than the 110s, so they must move first, just as the Spitfires move before the Hurricanes. This rigidity avoids confusion about which flights have already been activated in larger scenarios. To maintain their cover of the 110s, the 109s fly just 1 column and weave left into the same left block, which is allowed because the 110s have yet to move. They gain the usual 2 energy steps, taking their energy to 3.1. The Bf-110s now fly 2 columns straight ahead and accelerate similarly to energy 3.1. Now that their KE is 3, they can dive 2 levels next turn to level 7, and by turning right, they can drop onto the tails of the Hurricanes if these carry out their threatened head-on attack on the Stukas. On turn 2, the Spitfires could dive back down to cover the Hurricanes during their attack, but this would almost certainly expose them to being counter-attacked in turn by the covering 109s. They hence decide instead to maintain altitude and fly 2 columns straight back, with their energy increasing by 2 steps to 2.3. Despite the threat from the 110s, the Hurricanes decide that it is worth carrying out their head-on pass on the Stukas after all, relying on their superior manoeuvrability to evade subsequent counterattack. They gain no more energy now their KE is 3, so their energy remains 3.5. They could throttle right back to cut their energy to 2.6 and so reduce the closing speed to increase the chance of firing, but they decide it's more important to maintain energy given their performance inferiority. A preliminary D6 roll of 1 or 2 would fall below their KE of 3 and mean the pass is too fast for either side to fire. However, the roll is actually a 4, so the first combat of the scenario is joined. Combat in Dogfight Deluxe is now resolved by a single D6 roll, which is shared when both sides fire as they do in this case, so that good or bad luck affects both equally. A key improvement is that it now takes 2 hits rather than 1 to cause fighter flights to break away, with the first hit recorded by shifting the smaller tracking die in front of the counter. A hit may represent anything from minor damage to a single plane being shot down, depending on the number and type of target aircraft and the historical effectiveness of the firers. This variability allows even the most asymmetric real-life contests to be modelled as a balanced game. There are just a few simple potential modifiers as shown. The Stuka's roll is unmodified, so with a defense rating of 0 against the Hurricane's protection rating of 4, they will hit only on a 6. The Hurricane's greater firepower of 1 against the Stuka's lower protection of 3-4 means they need a modified roll of 4 or more. And since they also benefit from a +1 modifier, because multi-crew bombers are more valuable and easier to hit than fighters, an actual roll of 3 or more will suffice, with a roll of 6 rising to 7, and so scoring 2 hits rather than 1 because it exceeds the range shown on the table. The actual roll is 5, so the Hurricanes score a single hit on the Stukas without reply, giving them 1 net victory point towards the 3 or more which the British need to win. On such a natural score of 5, fighters will run low on ammo unless a further roll exceeds twice their firepower rating. But the Hurricanes avoid this fate by rolling 4. Had their firepower been 2, they could have made only 1 more attack before having to break off the action. The shaken Stukas fly on a further column, and their tracking die creeps up 1 more, to 5. The Bf-109s now need not maintain their cover of the 110s, so instead they opt to climb to level 10, as shown by the wispy cloud marker, to regain their height advantage over the approaching Spitfires. The climb allows them to choose a manoeuvre for a KE of 2, so they move just 1 column and weave 1 block right into the middle block. With no energy gain at an actual KE of 3, the 6-step loss for the climb takes their energy down to 2.1. It is time for the Bf-110s to carry out their threatened counterattack on the Hurricanes, so they fly 1 column forward, weave 1 block right, reverse heading, and dive down 2 levels to engage. The turn costs them 4 energy steps due to their poor manoeuvrability, but they gain 12 steps for the dive, so they would normally accelerate to energy 4.3. However, they choose to throttle back 3 steps to energy 3.6, so that G-forces at KE4 do not prevent them pursuing the Hurricanes next turn. Reversing heading stops them getting the attack bonus for diving out of the sun. The Hurricanes would normally be barred from evading because they fired during their own activation. However, the return fire from the Stukas distracts the 110s enough to negate this penalty, so the Hurricanes retain their ability to evade thanks to their superior turn rating of 5 compared to 4 for the 110s. This stops the German fighters getting the usual +1 modifier for being in the same heading as their targets. So, with a firepower of 1 against the Hurricane's protection rating of 4, they need to roll 5 or 6 to score a hit. On a 6, they're lucky and hit the British fighters regardless. But their success is double-edged, since this roll also means that any firing fighters automatically run low on ammunition and move their larger KE die in front of their counter to show that they may make only 1 more attack before breaking off. At least the net hits for the two sides are now equal again, leaving the Germans ahead by their handicap of 2. On turn 3, the Spitfires consider diving one level to shadow the Bf-110s from above, but this risks leaving the Bf-109s in an unassailable overwatch position. The Spitfires instead maintain height, fly back one column, weave left into the middle block, and accelerate to energy 2.5, only 2 steps less than the 109s ahead and above after accounting for the altitude difference. The Hurricanes opt to attempt a tight left turn, so as to escape the 110s and catch the Stukas as quickly as possible before the 109s can intervene. Their normal 2-step energy loss due to their turn grows to 3 for the tight turn attempt, so their energy falls to 3.2. The Hurricanes must roll 3 or more on a d6 to exceed their current climb rating of 2, and so turn tightly at this altitude. Having a turn rating 1 higher than their speed rating means there is no modifier to their roll, so on a 6, the Hurricanes easily succeed in moving forward into their original column after their heading change. The Stukas drone slowly on as usual, and though their tracking die finally reaches 6, they remain within reach of a tail attack by the Hurricanes next turn. The 109s decide that their best option is to fly 2 columns forward and dive back to level 9 for a head-on pass against the Spitfires. Their energy increases by 8 steps to 3.3, which will allow them to dive a further 2 levels and counter-attack the Hurricanes if they re-engage the Stukas next turn. The preliminary d6 roll in the combat with the Spitfires is 2. So, since the 109s have accelerated to a KE of 3, this head-on pass leaves insufficient opportunity for either flight to fire. The clumsy Bf-110s have a turn rating 1 lower than their speed rating, so their tight turn modifier is -4, leaving them no chance of rolling high enough to stay on the Hurricanes' tails at this altitude. They therefore make a normal left turn instead. Even this costs them another 4 energy steps, leaving them trailing behind the Hurricanes with energy now equal at 3.2. As the turn ends, the rear section of the board is cycled to the front to create an endless corridor of airspace ahead of the bombers, which entered the previous front section during their move. The dogfight has already assumed its classic pattern of a circling duel behind and above the bombers, as the escorts and interceptors struggle to get on one another's tails and to conduct or frustrate a firing pass on the vulnerable Stukas. On turn 4, the Spitfires face another difficult choice between making a normal diving turn to shadow the Bf-110s or attempting a tight turn to chase the Bf-109s and cover the Hurricanes as they re-engage the Stukas. The Spitfires decide to attempt the latter, circling right rather than left to avoid exposing themselves to a climbing attack by the 110s, and diving 1 level to give them the speed they will need to provide cover. At an initial KE of 2, they lose 1 net energy step for the tight turn attempt, but gain 6 steps for the dive, taking them to energy 3.4. As with the Hurricanes, they need to roll 3, 4, 5, or 6 to turn successfully. They roll a 6 and complete the tight turn as planned by advancing into their original column. The relieved Hurricanes fly 2 columns and weave 1 block left to attack the Stukas again from behind. Their energy remains unchanged at 3.2. In head-on combat with bombers, any prior weave or altitude change makes the engagement into an oblique attack, with little chance of a hit due to the incredible deflection shooting required. But in tail attacks like this one, oblique combats occur only if the attackers weave as many blocks as they move columns. Since Luftwaffe bombers in this period lacked the dedicated tail guns of other bombers like the Wellington or the Japanese Betty, which I represent with special shielding rules, the Hurricanes benefit from a total modifier of +2 in non-oblique tail attacks, and so need to roll only 2 or more to score another hit on the flimsy Stukas. However, the German rear gunners also get a +1 modifier at this angle, and so will score a return hit on a 5 or 6, as some compensation for the fact that the Hurricanes will score 2 hits rather than 1 on these rolls. The actual roll is a 3, so the British hit the Stukas again without reply, taking their net hits back to 1. The Stukas at last get the chance to move 2 columns, as their tracking die cycles from 6 back to 1. But this is actually a disadvantage at this point, because it will allow the Hurricanes to continue their attack next turn without overshooting, unless they're counterattacked in the meantime. The Stuka leader radios desperately for the escorts to come to his assistance. The Bf-109s decide that they cannot let the Hurricanes continue their attack unmolested, despite the threat from the covering Spitfires. They fly 2 columns straight ahead and dive 2 levels to counterattack the British fighters, gaining 12 energy steps and accelerating to an energy of 5.3. This high speed will cause them to overshoot the Hurricanes if their initial pass fails, but it will also allow them to zoom back up and outdistance any pursuit by the Spitfires. The fixation of the Hurricanes with the Stukas is counterbalanced by the need for the 109s to avoid friendly fire from the Stukas' rear gunners, so evasion is calculated normally. The 2 fighter types both have turn ratings of 5 at this altitude, to reflect their offsetting advantages in speed and agility. So, without rear-view canopies like those in the Bf-110s, neither may evade the other. The 109s hence receive the standard +1 tail attack bonus, and need to roll 4 or more to inflict the second hit, which will disperse the Hurricanes. They narrowly miss with a score of 3, so they succeed only in distracting the Hurricanes and preventing them continuing to attack the Stukas next turn. If the Bf-110s race forward with the aim of covering the Stukas in future, they risk being attacked themselves by the Spitfires. Instead, they climb 1 level to slow down, fly just 1 column, and weave left into a middle block, from which they can dive down again to cover the 109s should the Spitfires attack them. Their energy falls by 6 steps to 2.2. On turn 5, the Spitfires decide not to dive to counter-attack the Bf-109s after all, since this would expose them to the final attack by the Bf-110s and leave them unable to evade due to their fixation with the 109s. Instead, the Spitfires fly 2 columns straight ahead, staying just out of reach of the 110s and preparing to support the Hurricanes or set up their own future pass on the Stukas. Their energy remains constant at 3.4. The Hurricanes cannot continue attacking the Stukas this turn because of the distraction by the Bf-109s. They would like to fly 2 columns straight ahead and climb above the bombers, ready to dive on them next turn. But if they do so, the 109s could cut their throttles and stop short to remain on their tails despite their higher KE. Instead, the Hurricanes fly just 1 column by climbing and weaving right. This will force the 109s to overshoot, but the loss of 6 energy steps cuts the Hurricanes' energy to 2.2, and so stops them attacking the Stukas next turn as well. It might have been better for the Spitfires to risk engaging the 109s after all, allowing the Hurricanes to set up their third attack on the Stukas unmolested. The Stukas drone slowly on, grateful for this welcome respite from RAF attack. If the Bf-109s maintain their heading, their high speed will take them too close to the slow-moving Stukas, leaving them vulnerable and poorly positioned to provide cover. The 109s hence decide to take advantage of the lull in the RAF threat to the bombers by starting a full circle to regain a more effective overwatch position. Since even cutting their KE by climbing still leaves them with an effective KE of 4, they can zoom back up 2 levels to level 9 despite their turn, but they must weave 2 blocks rather than 1 because of G-forces at their high speed. They choose to turn right into the far right block, since this allows them to stay clear of a potential climbing turn by the Spitfires in the left block. They lose 2 energy steps due to the high initial drag, 3 due to their turn, and 12 for the climb, so their energy plummets by a swinging 17 steps to 2.4. The Bf-110s, with their KE of only 2, cannot manage the weave required to attack the Spitfires, so they make their maximum forward move 2 columns straight ahead as they race to regain a covering position behind the Stukas. Their energy increases by 2 steps to 2.4, and they decide not to dive so that they may accelerate next turn as well. As the turn ends, the second board rotation occurs. The Stuka rear gunners peer back anxiously at the wheeling fighters a mile behind them as they brace themselves for another attack wave to emerge. On turn 6, the Spitfires consider flying forward to join the Hurricanes in preparing to engage the Stukas, but then they spot an opportunity to try to ambush the Bf-109s instead. The Spitfires make a climbing right turn into the middle block at level 9, losing 2 energy steps for the turn and 6 for the climb, and so ending with energy 2.2, just 2 steps less than their quarry. Now, if the 109s complete their circle to face forward again as planned, the Spitfires will be perfectly placed to reverse their bank and turn left onto their tails. The 110s cannot forestall this by climbing to attack the Spitfires head-on, since fighters which start in the same block as an enemy can attack regardless as long as they reverse heading. This exception ensures that defensive circles cannot be broken simply by attacking both circling flights at once. The only way for the 109s to be sure of escape would be to continue flying back, and this risks them falling behind the bombers for good. The Hurricanes meanwhile fly 2 columns straight ahead to stay out of reach of the pursuing Bf-110s, and to prepare to drop down for an oblique attack on the Stukas at long last. Since their speed rating is only 4 rather than 5 for the other fighters, their energy increases by just 1 step to 2.3. The Stukas fly on as their rear gunners train their sights on the approaching Hurricanes, which have already scored 2 hits on the hapless bombers. The Bf-109s consider the desperate expedient of trying to outturn the more agile Spitfires. But since they need to roll 5 or 6 to make a tight turn, compared to 3, 4, 5 or 6 for the British planes, there's only a 1 in 9 chance of success. After careful calculation regarding the next board rotation at the end of turn 8, they decide instead to make a diving right weave while continuing to face back. Their energy grows by 8 steps to 3.6. Although the Spitfires could freely weave left onto their tails next turn, and even get the bonus for diving out of the sun, this risks condemning the British flight to falling behind the action when the rear board section next cycles to the front, while the 109s will be able to turn and move forward again just in time to escape this fate. This rather artificial consequence of where the interceptor and escort phases come in the sequence of play is actually a deliberate design feature to encourage the interceptors to focus on attacking the bombers rather than on climbing above and behind the covering escorts. The Bf-110s could climb for a head-on pass on the Spitfires after all, to ensure that they do not maintain their heading and chase the 109s. However, since the Spitfires are likely to turn forward instead in any case to avoid leaving the board, the 110s decide that it's better to maintain altitude and fly 2 columns ahead, ready to drop onto the Hurricanes' tails for a second time if they carry out their threatened attack on the Stukas. The 110s accelerate 2 steps to an energy of 2.6, but their potential contribution is now limited not only by their poor maneuverability, but also by their low ammo, which will force them to abstain from decisive bursts if they wish to remain a force in being to constrain the Hurricanes' attacks. On turn 7, the Spitfires must decide whether to launch a one-off tail attack out of the sun on the 109s, or to turn forward and pursue the Stukas now that the 109s have been driven far out of position. They're sorely tempted to risk bouncing the 109s, and then gambling on a successful tight turn to escape the fated rear board section just in time. But since exploiting the sun bonus would restrict them to a left turn into the far right block on their following move, they decide to turn straight away instead, so as to chase the more lucrative target of the Stukas. They could turn left for a head-on combat with the 109s, but they opt to turn up sun, so as to avoid damage and conserve their ammo for the bombers. They dive one level to increase speed for the pursuit, and opt to attempt a tight turn to gain an extra column. They lose 1 net energy step for the tight turn attempt, but gain 6 steps for the dive, leaving them with energy 3.1. On yet another roll of 6, their tight turn succeeds with ease, and they advance into their original column. Undeterred by the limited threat from the 110s, the Hurricanes weave down for an oblique attack from the right rear of the Stukas. Their counter is angled to show that they cannot weave back to the right next turn. They gain 1 more energy step in addition to the 6 steps from the dive, taking them to energy 3.4. Compared to their previous attack from directly behind the Stukas, the oblique attack gives both sides a -1 modifier. This means that the Hurricanes will hit only on 3 or more, but that the German rear gunners will hit and drive them off only on a 6. The roll is 4, so the Hurricanes' run of luck continues as a 3rd hit is scored on the Stukas for no reply. Net British victory points rise to 2, so they've managed to offset the default escort handicap with both of their flights still in play to inflict further hits in the turns to come. The surviving Stuka crews desperately press on with no sign of an end to their growing nightmare. The Bf-109s, relieved to have escaped the ambushing Spitfires, enter the fated rear board section as they circle right into the middle block. Their initial energy of 3.6 is just below the threshold which would require a wide, high G turn. They dive another level to increase speed so as to catch the bombers as quickly as possible. And like the Spitfires, they attempt a tight turn to gain a column. The turn hence costs them 4 of the 6 energy steps they gain by diving, so their energy increases only to 4.2. On a roll of 1 rather than the 5 or 6 required, the tight turn cost is wasted, and it's lucky the 109s are not dependent on success to remain in play, as the Spitfires would have been had they pursued them. The Bf-110s fly 2 columns straight ahead as planned, and dive onto the tails of the Hurricanes. They throttle back a little to cancel out the 2 energy steps which they would normally gain at KE2, so that their energy after the dive increases only to 3.6, thereby maintaining manoeuvre flexibility. The 110s could expend the last of their ammo for a 1 in 3 chance of scoring another hit, and driving the British fighters off at last. But they decide instead to hold their fire, in hopes of staying behind the Hurricanes next turn, and so preventing them from re-engaging the Stukas on turn 9. On turn 8, the Spitfires use their KE of 3 to fly 2 columns, weave right into the middle block, and dive to level 7. The 6-step gain from the dive takes their energy to 4.1, just enough to make a 3-column dash next turn and launch their own first attack on the beleaguered Stukas. The Hurricanes would have had to overshoot the Stukas this turn anyway, even without interference by the 110s. The proximity of the bombers prevents them reversing heading due to the risk of collision. So instead, they maintain altitude and fly forward 2 columns, weaving left to leave the Stukas' flight path. Their energy remains unchanged at 3.4. They hope to make a tight turn later to shake off the pesky 110s, and perhaps to repeat their initial head-on attack on the bombers. The Stukas enter the front board section as their tracking die reaches 5. Their crews watch the hated Hurricanes fly past with the Bf-110s in strangely muted pursuit. The Bf-109s race straight forward 3 columns, but thanks to their failure to turn tightly last turn, it's not quite enough to catch the speeding Spitfires. At least their energy of 4.2 allows them to absorb the 1-step drag loss while retaining an energy of 4.1 to allow a similar 3-column move next turn. The Bf-110s consider breaking off their pursuit of the Hurricanes and climbing to establish cover over the Stukas for the 1 turn before the 109s can catch up. However, if they do so, the Spitfires might attack them instead, rather than letting them launch their threatened counterattack. On balance, the 110s decide it is better to stick with the bird in hand. so they stay behind the Hurricanes, maintaining their energy of 3.6. Since the British fighters might now make a tight turn at any moment and leave them behind, the 110s decide that it is time to make their final throw and expend their last ammo in the hope of finally seeing off the charmed Hurricanes. Although the Bf-110s have a higher speed rating, the Hurricanes have the better turn rating, and so can evade the attack. The crucial combat die roll is 5, so the 110s again overcome this handicap and score a second hit on the British fighters. Both flights are inverted and will break off the action next turn. As board rotation occurs for the third time, net British hits have once again fallen back below the German handicap award. Both the Hurricanes and the clumsy Bf-110s have performed beyond the call of duty, and their offsetting contributions mean that the contest remains on a knife edge, with only the Spitfires and the desperately pursuing Bf-109s left in action to decide the final victor. On turn 9, while the surviving Hurricanes break away, the Spitfires seize their one turn of grace before the 109s catch up by flying 3 columns straight ahead for a high-speed pass from directly behind the Stukas. Drag at a KE of 4 reduces their energy by 1 step to 3.6. The Spitfires benefit from the same +2 modifier as the Hurricanes received on turn 4, so even their roll of 2 is just enough to allow them to inflict a 4th hit without reply due to the Stuka's feeble protection rating, bringing the victory balance back to equality between the two sides. The surviving Stuka crews, elated by the Bf-110's avenging hits on the Hurricanes, are thrown into renewed gloom by the Spitfire's equally effective attack. At least the bombers do not move 2 columns again until next turn, so the Spitfires will be forced to overshoot in the meantime. As the satisfied Bf-110s break away with their magazines empty, the 109s make the same 3-column dash as the Spitfires did, so as to regain at last their covering position behind the Stukas. Their energy falls 1 step to 3.6, just as for the Spitfires. On turn 10, the Spitfires capitalize on the Stuka's imminent 2-column move by climbing to dump speed and flying 2 columns straight ahead to stay well out of reach of the pursuing 109s for now, thereby preparing to dive steeply back for another pass from directly behind the Stukas next turn. Their energy falls by 6 steps to 2.6. The Stukas duly make their second 2-column move of the game, grateful at least that the Bf-109s will at last be in range to counterattack the Spitfires if they attack the bombers again. The 109s opt to maintain altitude so as to retain the flexibility given by a KE of 3. They fly 2 columns and weave 1 block left, retaining their energy of 3.6 and comfortably covering the Stukas against attack. As the board sections rotate for a 4th time, due to the Stuka's 2-column move, the contest has reached a familiar endgame, with single escort and interceptor flights jockeying for position as they seek to inflict the final decisive hit. Had either side had more fighter flights in play at any stage, my rules provide for that side to suffer from poor situational awareness as friends outnumber foes, though the distinctive Bf-110s are easier for both sides to identify. On turn 11, the Spitfires use the special rules for stopping short during attacks so as to fly just 1 column straight ahead, usually possible only at a KE of 1, and dive 1 level to re-engage the Stukas. The normal 6 energy step gain for the dive is completely cancelled by the requirement to throttle back by the full 6 steps when stopping short for a tail attack. But the Spitfires still benefit from the usual 2-step acceleration at an initial KE of 2, so they end with an energy of 3.2. This time, the combat die roll is a 6, so the Spitfires inflict 2 more hits for a total of 6. The downside of this success is that the Spitfires automatically run low on ammo, as the Bf-110s did on turn 2. And the bomber's rear gunners finally hit one of the British fighters in return. These 2 penalties in combination mean that the Spitfires are inverted and will break off the action next turn. The surviving Stuka crews fly on with a surge of relief as their ordeal ends at last. Everything now comes down to the Bf-109s, which weave in to counter-attack the Spitfires before they can escape into the shelter of the clouds below. As on turn 4, the British concentration on engaging the Stukas is counterbalanced by the friendly fire risks posed to the 109s by the bombers' defensive gunfire, so evasion is calculated normally. This time, however, the British fighters have similar maximum speed to the 109s, so their superior agility is not compromised as was that of the Hurricanes. With a turn rating of 6 against the 109's 5, the Spitfires can evade despite their own attack on the Stukas and despite lacking rear-view canopies. The German fighters hence have no fire modifier for being in the same heading, and so need to roll 5 or 6 to score a single parting hit. Like the 110s, they have the good fortune to roll a 5, so the Spitfires are hit again before they can escape. The roll of 5 means the 109s must check for ammo depletion, but they avoid this by rolling another 5, and it would not have mattered anyway for the purposes of the current contest. The game ends on turn 12, as soon as the surviving Spitfires break away. The British score 6 points for their 6 hits on the Stukas, while the Germans score 4 points for their 2 hits each on the Hurricanes and Spitfires, plus 2 points for their default game handicap. The contest is hence a draw, with 6 points each. However, had this been a competitive game, player bidding to command the British would almost certainly have increased the German handicap bonus to compensate for the notorious vulnerability of the Stukas, which this game demonstrated all too well. The Germans were lucky that 3 of their 4 fighter attacks scored hits, despite the evasive agility of the British fighters. But the British were also lucky that all 3 of their tight turn attempts succeeded, and that 4 of their 5 attacks on the Stukas inflicted hits without the attacking fighters running low on ammo or being hit by return fire. Although luck plays a realistically high role in Dogfight Deluxe, especially in small scenarios like this one, the game showed how players' skill in making the kind of judicious maneuver choices and tactical trade-offs which I have described also plays a leading role. Hits mostly represent damage rather than aircraft being shot down, so the system avoids the unrealistic mutual carnage characteristic of air combat computer games. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Dogfight Deluxe, and that it has given you a clearer sense of how the systems work and how the game plays. As I said, this and several of the other games and conversions I've designed recently are shared for free on my Simulating War I.O. group and on the Board Game Geek pages for their parent games. Canvas Aces Deluxe now includes not only a revised and improved Grand Tactical version, covering air-to-ground as well as air-to-air combat, but also a new tactical variant modelling dogfights between flights of individual fighters. I include solitaire rules, covering the classic World War I scenario of a duel between a lone fighter and a manoeuvring recon plane. All of these variants are covered by my random scenario generation system, and all of them may be played on exactly the same simple gridded board you need for Dogfight. A Kickstarter campaign to fund an improved second edition of Carlo Amadeo's parent game Winged Victory now includes these extra components as a stretch goal. Dogfight's much more tactical top-down partner game, Fighter Duel Deluxe, may now be played on any sufficiently large hex-gridded board, using the data cards and single plane counters from Wing Leader. As shown, these counters have the great advantage that they may be laid on their side or sandwiched upright to give a direct representation of the contending fighter's bank attitude. My unique solitaire system for Fighter Duel has now been expanded to let you put any or all pilots on one or both sides under AI control, allowing you to use proper formation tactics against the AI, to team up and fly cooperatively instead of head-to-head, or to fly a single plane in a large dogfight as in air combat computer games. This is the only board game system I know which provides dedicated solitaire rules for manoeuvring combat between flights of individual fighters. You can also play my new Diver Patrol scenario and try to catch and down an elusive V1 over Kent in summer 1944 without your own plane being damaged in the process. It remains only to thank Lee Brimacombe Wood for the beautiful components and elegant systems design in his now complete portfolio of Wing Leader games, all of which may be used to offer even more variety and interest within the endless possible scenarios in my Dogfight Deluxe and Fighter Duel Deluxe conversions. Using these interlinked designs, you may now refight any daylight air combat from 1936 to 1945, at any scale, from individual aircraft to entire squadron and wing formations. Enjoy!